Welcome to the History of Nerds and I podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Richard Goodrich returns to chat with me today. It was great to talk to him again. His new book, LA Birdmen, West Coast Aviators and the First Airshow in America. I love this type of book. I didn't know anything about this stuff. And then you start reading it and you're like, oh, I know that name. I know that name. Wait, they did what? Love this book. It's fantastic. It was great to talk to Richard again. So how about I just shut up and we hear from him. And here we are with author Richard Goodrich, LA Birdmen, West Coast Aviators, and the First Airshow in America. Richard, thank you so much for coming back.
It's great to be back, Brendan. We had a great time last year, and I was really excited to get the invitation to come back and talk to you again.
Absolutely. Last time we're talking about a comet killing all of humankind.
That's right.
And now we're talking about aviators. I really love this book. I didn't know what to expect with it, Richard, just because, it's all of a sudden I'm like, what do you mean aviation on the West Coast? How did you even focus on this? How did you find any of this stuff? How did you come about writing LA Birdmen?
Well, actually, it does tie into my Comet Madness book, which we talked about last year. So as I was doing the research for Comet Madness and going through newspapers, including the LA Times, I stumbled across the story of this air show that I'd never heard of, the 10-day Los Angeles International Aviation Exposition. And that ran January 10th to 20th in Los Angeles. And I just never heard of that at all. I mean, I'm a pilot, so I have background in aviation, but this was completely new to me. So when I finished writing Comet Madness, I resolved to go back and at least look into this and see what it was all about. And I got very intrigued with this air show. This was the first international air show in America. And it was the first time that heavier than air machines had flown west of the Mississippi. So for most of the people who came to LA, they'd never actually seen an airplane fly. And this was still back in a time when a lot of people claimed they could fly, but very few were ready to prove it. So I started looking at that, and I thought I would write a book just about the air show. But then the characters who appeared in the air show were so interesting, I started following their stories backward, and eventually it became mostly a book about the West Coast aviators who had actually challenged the East Coast, in essence, for aerial supremacy. And for really the first 7 or 8 years of aviation in America, they were on top.
I do have to say that you calling these characters interesting is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. We got crackpots. We got extreme arrogance. Sometimes you can call it confidence because some of them could back it up, and we'll get to that. But they are so colorful. That's what I was amazed with. I want to step back, actually, because what I really like about this book, and I've read a few books like this, it made me rethink something from history that I took for granted, which is the Wright Brothers were the first aviators. And that's not necessarily true if you play with definitions, because it made me think, first of all, wait a second, we've had hot air balloons. They've been in the air, they're flying. And then we've had dirigibles and things like that. I really liked that this book took that and you started to say, hey, this is what this means and this is what this means. And as you just said, lighter than air means something in aviation that we wouldn't necessarily think about, right?
Correct. Yes, so there is this mass delusion that the Wright brothers were the first aviators in America, or even the first, sometimes you'll hear people say, the first ones to fly a motorized aircraft in America. And that's simply not true, because that belongs to Auguste Greth, who was a San Francisco doctor. He was an immigrant from France. He was very interested in aviation, and he came to America. And after setting himself up in his medical practice, he went on, built the California Eagle, which was a large dirigible, and flew it over San Francisco in October of 1903, and this is 2 months before the Wrights make their first flight at Kitty Hawk. So technically speaking, the Wrights are the first Americans to fly a heavier-than-air aircraft, motorized heavier-than-air aircraft. But if you want to talk about the first motorized aircrafts in America, it certainly belongs to Auguste Greth.
Now, when we say a dirigible, is that the same as, well, what else would we call it? Just an airship? For people who don't know what a dirigible is, how do we even define that?
Airship and dirigible are basically synonymous, and so they are a lighter-than-air machine. They are lifted with gas, so hydrogen, typically helium now. They don't usually use hydrogen anymore. And it's motorized and controllable. So a hot air balloon or even a hydrogen balloon, once you cast off the ropes, you're going where the wind's going to take you. Essentially, you have no motorized control. You have no way to steer your balloon. You can go up and down to a certain extent, so you can look for different layers of wind which take you in different directions. But the great innovation of the dirigible is that you now have a propeller that's pulling you through the air, and you in some cases, have some mechanism of steering that machine and making it go up and down.
I love those definitions. I know we can't see you right now, but I see that smile come across your face because I know it comes up of whether or not they can go up or down or left or right, or if the wind is more than 3 miles per hour, they might not be moving at all, right?
Yes. Certainly the early dirigibles did have a problem with engines. And often the dirigibles would be inadvertently converted into hydrogen balloons when their engines failed and the pilots couldn't get them restarted. So you had to kind of resort to the old skills you'd learned of flying hot air balloons or hydrogen balloons just to keep yourself alive and get back on the ground.
Let's get back to some of these crazy characters, crazy, wonderful characters. How about, let's start with Tom Baldwin and Roy Knabenshue. Hopefully I said that one right. That's a little rough.
So Baldwin, and I call him Knabenshue. You may be right, Knabenshue. They are probably the most famous early aviators of the 20th century. And so this is, again, going back to this question of the Wrights. Once the Wrights had made their flights at Kitty Hawk, the next summer they went to Huffman Prairie and they advanced the flyer, but they did pretty much all their flight testing in secret. And, the big outcry was, they said, we have this machine that will fly, but they were unwilling to do a public exhibition of that and prove that they could actually get off the ground. And this, as you might imagine, caused a lot of discomfort, I suppose, credibility problems, perhaps, because there had been many people at this time who claimed to have a flying machine. So the Wrights aren't going to actually fly in public until 1908. And the reason they don't do that is they're afraid that people are going to steal their ideas. Until they get patent protection, they don't want to risk having, this snatched away from them. And so they pretty much do secret flight testing. They tell people they can fly, but the proof is hard to find on the ground. So if you were to go back in some sort of time machine to say 1906 or 1907 and ask anybody on the street, who are the aviators around here? Who's flying in this country? They're going to say Tom Baldwin and Roy Knabenshue, because these are really the two foremost aviators of their day. And they're both flying dirigibles. Tom Baldwin is, as you say, a character. We don't really know a lot about his past other than what he told newspapers of the day, and that was his parents were killed by rebels in the Civil War, and he was orphaned at a very young age, forced to go off and make his own way. He joined the railroad, and one day a circus manager saw him gambling across the tops of the railway cars and said, "Boy, you should be a trapeze artist. Come join the circus." So Baldwin ran away, joined the circus, became a trapeze artist. Whether his parents were really killed in the Civil War or not, that remains an open question, but he did become a trapeze artist. And so in the late 19th century and starting into the 20th century, he's doing all sorts of stunts around San Francisco. And ultimately, you have to kind of keep ahead of the competition. So Baldwin finds out about these acrobats who've come up with a parachute, and he does some parachute testing and decides that, the great thing to do would be to jump out of a hot air balloon and fly down to the ground with this parachute and make this spectacular landing. And of course, charge everybody in the park for the privilege of watching him risk his life. And when you think about parachutes today, you think about, this very sophisticated device, and you're all strapped in and you have a harness. Well, Baldwin is just hanging on to essentially a trapeze bar, and he's jumping out from 1,000, 2,000 feet and just sitting there hanging by his hands from a trapeze bar and gliding down to the earth. So it really was a spectacular feat, no question about it. Later, he's going to get into hot air ballooning, so he's going to try to set some ballooning records. But when he finds out about what August Greth had done, flying across San Francisco, he kind of weasels his way onto August Greth's team. He's got all this pilot experience now that he's a big hot air ballooner. and tries to help fly the California Eagle. Greth and Baldwin are going to have a difference of opinion, so Greth is going to go off and build his own ship, the California Arrow, a competing vessel.
I have jumped out of a plane 5 times. It is scary enough when you know these things are tested and put together well. But it just kind of, when I said crackpot before, like there's something crazy in each one of them because none of this is safe. This is really pushing the envelope of everything.
Well, this is how innovation happens. You've got to be living out there on the edge. You can't take the
Somebody else can live on the edge. I'm going to stay at home.
Yeah, there's an old pilot saying about parachuting. It doesn't make much sense to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. Mm-hmm. So I've never shared that experience myself. The thing that starts to drive all of the aviators in America is in 1903, the St. Louis World's Exposition happens, and they decide there have been flights in Paris that have taken place. And so they decide that what we'll do is we'll do something innovative to kind of blot out the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and we'll have an aviation pavilion. And so they invite all the aviators of the country to come fly around a 15-mile course, and whoever makes it around in the fastest time, averaging 15 miles an hour. Initially, the offer was for $200,000. So the pilot who came out on top in this would win $200,000. That's about $7 million today in our inflated money. Later on, they cut that down to $100,000, but still, that $3.5 million. That's not a bad gig.
I'd take it.
Yeah. And so the leading pilot on the globe at this point was a man named Alberto Santos Dumont, who was Brazilian. He had gone to Paris believing that the French must be leading the world's aviation industry because they had invented the hot air balloon. But when he got there, he found nobody had done anything. And so he was the one who really started putting engines on balloons and coming up with elongated shapes rather than sort of the lollipop shape you think about when you're talking about a hot air balloon. And he was successful. So he was really the first dirigible pilot on the planet. His success inspired the people of the organizers of the 1903 World's Fair. And so they built this big aviation pavilion with the idea that all of America's aviators and Santos Dumont would come to St. Louis, and you'd have this spectacle that would just completely eclipse Chicago. Nobody would ever think about the Chicago World's Fair again because of what they had done there. In fact, what happened is what Santos Dumont thought probably would happen is that the world just wasn't ready to have an aviation competition at that time. However, Tom Baldwin had his eyes on this prize, and so he had cobbled together the California Arrow to compete with August Greth, and he was determined to go and win some money in St. Louis. The problem was when he got to St. Louis, he had severe doubts about whether his dirigible would be able to fly around a 15-mile course, averaging 15 miles per hour. And in fact, he didn't even ship most of it. He shipped the envelope, the balloon, and he shipped the engine, and that was it to St. Louis, I guess, to save shipping fees or something. And so when he got there, he had to figure out how to build a new dirigible in time. And what he did is he cut a deal with the organizers. Now, this was by the autumn of 1903, nobody had flown yet. And so he said, look, I'll fly 4 flights and you pay me a fixed sum of money. We don't know how much that was. It was certainly less than the $100,000 that was originally on offer. But if he could get off the ground 4 times, then they would pay him. And that's what Baldwin wanted. And so he hired a man from Toledo named Roy Knabenshue. And Roy was a phone company guy, electrical engineer by trade, but he was a balloonist by night, much to the extreme dismay of his father, who thought his son was wasting his life and bringing incredible discredit and dishonor upon the Knabenshue name, which was very highly regarded in Toledo, Ohio at that time. And so Roy had to fly in secret mostly. And so he flew under a stage name. And ultimately, he came to this point in his life where he had to make a choice. Do I go on with this career in aviation, or do I take the safe road and just go back to being an electrical engineer and keeping my wife and my growing family and my father happy? He chose the latter. He went to St. Louis, hoping to find something there, and he met up with Tom Baldwin. And so the two of them rebuilt the California Arrow, basically the entire superstructure from the ground up. And there they were, ready to test it out in October.
Well, I'll just say it. Tom felt like the type of guy that might steal from you if he thought he can get away with it. Whereas I felt like with Roy was just addicted to this aviation bug. Am I not giving Tom enough credit, or am I giving Roy too much credit?
Yes. If you read the book, you're going to come to the conclusion, I think, inevitably, that Tom is just a little bit shifty. And so he does... Well, he's a showman, really, and this is the problem. He doesn't want the spotlight to be on anybody other than himself, and he's made a career of doing that. And so you could argue he didn't play very fair with August Greth. He didn't play very fair with John J. Montgomery, who helped him actually build parts of the California Aero. And yes, his later career is a bit checkered as well. But he was innovative, and he had a vision, and he was ready to do the least possible to fulfill the terms of his contract that he'd made in St. Louis. And this is what he told Roy Knabenshue. Now, Baldwin originally was going to fly the California Aero, but he was a kind of a portly man. And when he got aboard, they found that you couldn't get enough hydrogen into the balloon to lift him off the ground. So he had to resort to letting Roy fly.
That's going to hurt the ego just a little bit. No matter who you are, that's going to hurt the ego.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely does, because it kind of pushes him out of center stage. But he kept telling Roy, just fly over the fence. There's a 15-foot fence surrounding the aviation pavilion. Fly over the fence and land. As long as you get off the ground, hop over the fence, that's a flight right there. Don't risk the machine. Don't risk this hydrogen, which they have to pump the balloon full of, which is pretty expensive. Just do the minimum possible, fulfill the terms of the contract, and we'll be fine. Roy had I don't know. Did he deliberately defy Tom Baldwin? I mean, he took off and the balloon just went up like a rocket.
Oh, basically. He deliberately defied him. I don't think he planned to defy him, but he most definitely did.
Yeah, in his autobiography, he doesn't explain this particular incident. He says, well, here's what Tom wanted, here's what happened, and I was really afraid after the first flight that I was going to be in a lot of trouble with Tom. He doesn't give away his thinking on that point.
I mean, it feels like a Hollywood movie, right? This kid that has loved this type of stuff is putting his life on the line, but also, as you said, his dad's mad at him, he's got a family, he's got a support, but he loves this, and then he gets with this guy who, shifty, I like that word, just says, just do the bare minimum.
So how about self-promoting, Brennan? Would you go with self-promoting? Shifting. It's.
Well, tell you what, I think we can go with that, because as soon as we're done with this point, we're going to go back to the people who are real jerks in this story, but we'll come back to it. but then Roy, I can just picture it, an old-timey movie where the kid makes right, he gets up there and he says, I'm just going to go for it. I am in the air. We weren't even sure we were going to make it this far, and he says, let's see what happens, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's a huge deal now, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, because he lifts off the ground, and basically it works. Baldwin had doubted it was going to work when he'd done a couple test hops in California, and that was with the machine he didn't bring anyway, so he had some doubts about it. You could say he was trying to save Roy's life, not put him at too much risk by just making this short little test hop, maybe. See? Mm-hmm. I find myself defending Tom Baldwin, and I'm not sure why that is. You pushed me into a corner, Brendan. Oh, boy.
Well, it's kind of a Steve Jobs situation, fake it until you make it, sometimes pushing the envelope, literally in this particular instance. But it's okay. We'll leave Tom alone. We'll be nice to him from here on out.
Yeah, so Roy, on this very first flight, he gets off the ground and it just basically launches. He barely misses the Brazilian pavilion. It steers towards the Ferris wheel, barely misses that. And what he learns from this is, I can steer this thing. It's working. So he's got a rudder, which controls our motions right and left. Pitch is controlled. You have to kind of imagine this. I know we're doing this audio, but imagine a very long scaffolding running the length of the balloon, and on the very front of that is mounted the engine and the propeller, and at the back is a big rudder. And for pitch control to go up and down, the pilot has to run back and forward on this thing. So you run into the nose to pull the nose down, and then you will descend, or you run more to the back of the center of gravity to pitch the nose up if you want to go up. And so very limited controls at this stage, but it flies, and he's able to maneuver around over the St. Louis Exposition, which I should say, I misspoke slightly a little earlier. It's actually 1904. It was supposed to open in 1903, but it was delayed a year. So it was in 1904, October 1904, when the first flight happened. And he's went up, flew around, and then the engine died. And this is a very common occurrence at this time. And he essentially got blown over the Mississippi River, had to vent some of that precious hydrogen and landed in a farmer's field. But he makes this first flight at the St. Louis Exposition, and this in some way justifies all of those visionaries who said, let's put up this huge prize and go to the considerable expense of building this massive aviation pavilion from which no aircraft has flown until nearly the end of the show. And he makes it. Yeah, and he goes on and does 3 other flights at this show.
It would probably be easier to list the amount of times where the engines worked all the way through. I feel like that's a much shorter list because either the engine doesn't work on the ground, they get up in the air, the engine doesn't work, they got to fix it, they come down. It's a lot.
Yes, so early aviation engines were not terribly reliable. There's no doubt about it. In America, at least, the early dirigible pilots are using Curtiss motorcycle engines. So Glenn Curtiss had originally been a bicycle racer, and then he came up with the bright idea of hooking an engine onto his bicycle to make a motorcycle. And he became a high-speed motorcycle racer and for a long time held the world's record for motorcycle speed. And then he got interested in aviation and started making engines for airships and later airplanes. But yes, the first ones did have a tendency to pack in quite frequently. So they weren't terribly reliable.
All right, we're going to have to skip a couple of crazy stories because there's so many in here. We got to get to the air show. How does the air show even start to come about? Because what's LA like at this point in time, right? Everybody's going to think about LA as it is now. But when we talk about LA around the time of the air show, what does it look like? How many people were there? What's going on there?
Actually, I looked up the census information for you this morning.
I know you'd be prepared. I knew it.
The 1910 census had 319,000 people in Los Angeles. So actually, we tend to think of LA as being the epicenter of California, not only its cultural and significance, but the fact that big earthquakes happen there. But of course, it was San Francisco that was the leading city in California at this time. And so LA was a much smaller city. It was kind of an upstart place. Didn't really have a lot going for it when you think about it. It doesn't really have a port until it finally expands out to the coast. It had kind of a dodgy water supply. The LA River, sometimes it ran, sometimes there was a drought that dried it all up. What's going on there? Oil. So oil was discovered in Los Angeles early in the 20th century, and they start planting oil wells. You don't tend to think of Los Angeles as being kind of a Texas experience, but you did have oil wells pumping. And I think in the 1920s, Los Angeles contributed a quarter of the world's oil supply, which arguably was much less than it is now. But it was a city that was striving. The movie theaters or movie producers don't start migrating until around 1910 as well. The city fathers wanted to challenge San Francisco. They wanted to make essentially a West Coast New York, if you will, and have a major city. And they wanted Los Angeles to be that city. So it was a city that was on the rise. And ultimately, it's going to become the most important city in California, if not the United States, some would argue.
Now, one of the reasons that it almost doesn't even happen, and listen, we've been slapping around Tom Baldwin a little bit. He is not the villain of this story, people. And also, before I say their names again, I want to be clear that you don't say they're terrible people in this. You just report how they act and what they did. The Wright brothers do not come off as good people in this story. Did you have to work really hard not to call them a jerk right in the book?
Writing the book and researching the book, I lost a lot of respect for the Wright brothers. How about that, if you'll accept that? They had reason to be suspicious of the rest of the world, I suppose. They had done something that's very incredible. They were very unwilling to acknowledge that what they had done actually was built on the shoulders of work that other people had done. And so they were deeply suspicious of the world, and they were convinced that given an opportunity, the world was going to steal their invention. So they were very protective of it. And as I said when we were talking a little earlier, they wouldn't do a public exhibition. They wouldn't say, look, actually they were invited to come to the St. Louis Exposition and fly the Wright Flyer. There is a reasonable chance that they could have, by that time, or at least late 1904, made a 15-mile circuit and won the $200,000. I mean, that would have been pretty sweet. But no, they weren't going to do it because they didn't want to risk the even bigger money that they felt they would make by protecting their invention. So until they had their patents secured, it wasn't going to happen. And once they did have their patents secured, and this is where I think we get into problems, they start suing everybody, anybody who even looks like they're infringing on their patents. So they're going to claim that they invented wing warping. And wing warping is just basically a device which, when you push your stick right or left, it changes the shape of the wings by pulling the wingtips up or down. And it warps the wings, basically, and that gives you control to raise or lower either your right or left side. They claim they invented this. It has been, I think, fairly well established by now that actually another California aviator, Professor J.J. Montgomery, in his glider experiments, had invented wing warping by studying the flights of gulls and building gliders of his own. Nevertheless, the Wrights went ahead. They were incredibly litigious, and they did try to shut down the 1910 California Airshow because men like Glenn Curtiss and Louis Paulhan, flying a Farman biplane from France, were, in their view, infringing upon their patents. And so they essentially wanted a piece of everybody who wanted to build a plane from the time that they had their patent secured in 1906.
You just mentioned another character that we can't get through the book without talking about him. I will call him a bombastic Frenchman. I don't think those two words have ever been put together in history, but we'll call him that. Can you please talk about this aviator who basically stole the show in a lot of ways?
Bombastic. Charismatic, how about that?
Sure.
Audacious. Louis Paulhan was an early French aviator, and so, of course, while the Wrights are doing their thing, and Glenn Curtiss is beginning. I mean, Glenn Curtiss, by the way, did the first public exhibition of an airplane with his Junebug. While he's doing that, in France, you have men like Henry Farman, who's building it. Blériot is building monoplanes. And so you have a rapidly growing aviation industry as well. And so in August 1909, the world's aviators came together at the Reims Airshow. And this was the first time you had multiple airplanes up in the air competing with each other for prizes. Louis Paulhan came out of nowhere. He was flying a Farman biplane, and he was in the thick of the competition to win all the prizes. And then he crashed, I think, on day 6 of the competition, and that kind of threw him out of the mix. He was invited to come to the Los Angeles International Aviation Exposition, in January of 1910. And nobody really knew much about him when he came over, but he brought over 2 Farman biplanes. And everybody in America knew all about him by the time he left 10 days later, because he is just going to take over the show. He is incredibly daring. He will do things with an airplane that nobody believed at the time could be done. And he monopolizes the show.
I mean, legendarily competitive with what he was willing to do, because if anybody looked like they were about to outshine him, I mean, he put his money where his mouth was every single time. It was amazing.
Yes, absolutely. He set cross-country distance records at this point. This was at a time when most aviators wouldn't leave the proximity of the field, because if your engine quit, which hardly ever happened,
of course,
you'd want to be able to glide back down and land safely at your airfield. But he just took off and went for nice long flights and set a world altitude record as well. So a little over 4,000 feet set at the air show, which doesn't seem like very much today, but at that time it was an incredible record for a heavier than air machine.
And it's worth mentioning when we've talked about expositions, world fairs, people must have lost their minds, because you're going back to the early 1900s. You might, live just outside of LA on a farm. You never see much. Anything that you can, really know outside of your own little world, you'd have to read in a book. But then you can go down, you can pay for your ticket, and all of a sudden you're seeing people flying. It must have driven people nuts. And I mean, especially for the World's Fair, you had, I think it was a few million visitors at least per year, where everyone went because it was all there for you to see, and you would never see anything like this again.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, the Los Angeles show was 10 days long. It was a record-setting show. Over 100,000 people came. They installed, a train platform, and they were bringing trains out from the city that were running every 2 minutes, bringing visitors back and forth to the show. It drew people from all across the country. So not only did people come from across the country, but it was front page news on newspapers all across the country while it was running as well, all these things that were going on. My favorite story of a person who was drawn to the show was a young man from Hoquiam, Washington, which is up on the northwest coast of Washington. And he had come out from Michigan, and he was in the timber business. So at this time, that part of the Pacific Northwest was known as the Green Klondike, because people came out and made their fortunes in the timber industry. And this young man, William, did the same thing, and he'd been very successful out there. He'd acquired quite a bit of money. When he heard about the Los Angeles show, he thought, oh, that would be great. And so he traveled down from upstate Washington down to Los Angeles and was absolutely enthralled by everything he saw. So this competition that primarily devolved into a competition between Glenn Curtis and Louis Paulhan. And he was a wealthy young man, so he went to both of these aviators and said, I want a ride. So they're giving out a limited number of rides. But of course, as you would imagine, with tens of thousands of people showing up at the show every day, everybody wanted a ride, and they just couldn't handle the demand. And so William was frustrated because neither of these pilots would give him a ride. And he was so angry that he went back to the Northwest and ultimately moved to Seattle and started building his own airplane. So if these guys won't give me a ride, I'll build my own airplane. And most of the listeners, I'm sure, will probably recognize his last name because his name was William Boeing. And he went on to build just more than a couple of aircraft. His company continues to do so today. And so this was the impact on one man's life, which was he went to this show, was so inspired by what he saw that he basically founded the largest aircraft company in the world. Is Boeing larger than Airbus? I'm not sure.
Who knows? Probably. Well, let's just say yes.
1 and 2, yeah.
Somebody will send us a comment telling us which one it is.
That's right.
All right, I have 2 time travel questions for you. Number 1, I send you back in time, you meet Tom Baldwin. Mm-hmm. He says, get in one of my aircraft and go fly it. How much would he have to pay you for you to do it? Are you said you're an aviator, right? Would you be so excited? You'd be like, I'm going to do this for free? Or you're like, dude, you got to pay me first.
Well, I'd want a cut of the gate, and Tom would respect that.
That makes sense, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think Tom and I would agree immediately. I mean, he'd probably shave me down to about 20% or something like that and save 80 for himself. But yeah, wouldn't that be amazing? Absolutely. I would do it.
Okay. Well, next one. I can send you back in time. You can only talk to one person who's in your book. Who would it be?
Oh, that's a tough... yeah, I'd have to say Roy Knabenshue is my favorite character as I was writing. So I think I would want to talk to Roy, definitely.
Yeah, he'd be first on my list. I feel like you'd sit down with him, you'd have a good drink, he'd tell a few stories. And he just seems, I don't want to say innocent, that's not the right word, genuine. He feels like the most genuine person out there. Whereas, like Louis Paulhan, he might be a little bit much to sit down and talk with. I respect how much he was willing to do, but I feel like he was probably a talker in a bad way.
I could see Louis bouncing off the walls quite a bit, maybe a little excitable. He was definitely very excitable. But yes, I think, Tom, you could sit down and have a drink with him and have a very enjoyable conversation.
All right, Richard, you had to answer this question before, but I still got to ask it. Some people are like, history is boring. Why should I read it? I put LA Birdmen in their lap and they look at you and say, why should I read this? What would you say?
I think they're going to find it's a very enjoyable story. And so there's a lot of humor in it. And there are, as I think you've already pointed out, some, I just can't believe these moments in there. And who would be so nuts as to do these kinds of things? And you think about that spirit of innovation. And I would hate to be pessimistic and say we've lost it. But just the fortitude to go in there and sew a bunch of silk together, build an envelope, strap something onto it in a machine and go off and try to fly like that. It was an amazing thing. And I don't know if we've just become, innovation and that sort of thing has become, the bar has been raised so high that you can't really go out and invent something amazing like that. But I just found it inspirational, I suppose, is the word that I would use for these guys. Because, Rather than sit and be on Facebook all day, or, little guys sitting in their basements playing video games, these guys, they actually went out and did things that were ultimately groundbreaking and led to the fact that I can get on a plane and fly to Europe if I need to tomorrow. I genuinely found them very inspirational, and I think people who read the book are going to be amused. They're going to have those I don't believe it moments, but I think they'll find him quite inspirational as well.
Yes, thank God for the crazies. They really push stuff forward.
Visionaries.
Richard, the book's fantastic. Thank you once again for coming on.
Thank you, Brendan. It was a pleasure, as always, to be here.
And that's it for this episode. Richard, thank you so much. LA Birdmen, it's fantastic, people. Go out and get it. Hit us up, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.